In a small town nestled between green hills and calm rivers, lived a young man named Jonathan. He was raised in a modest household, with a loving mother and a father who was a fisherman. From an early age, Jonathan was taught the importance of hard work, humility, and the idea that life wasn't just about what you had, but who you were. His parents often shared stories of how they had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, teaching Jonathan the value of resilience and the strength of belief. Jonathan, however, found himself struggling with the traditional path laid out before him. The town he lived in had a rhythm, one that revolved around the steady routine of farming, fishing, and community gatherings. But Jonathan, ever curious, felt that there was something more he was meant to do with his life. He often found himself staring at the horizon, wondering about the world beyond his small town. One evening, as he was walking by the river, deep in thought about his future, he met an old man who had appeared out of nowhere. The man, with a long white beard and wise, tired eyes, seemed like he had been waiting for Jonathan. He approached him with a gentle smile, as though he knew exactly what the young man was going through. "Young man," the old man said softly, "I can see the questions in your heart. You are searching for something, aren't you?" Jonathan, startled by the old man's insight, nodded. "I feel as though I'm meant for more than this, but I don't know where to start or how to find what I'm looking for." The old man chuckled. "The answers you seek are not always easy to find, but they are always within you. You must learn to discern them, to listen to the whispers of your heart, and to trust the guidance that comes from a source far beyond yourself." At that moment, Jonathan felt a spark of curiosity ignite within him. He had always heard stories about divine guidance, about God's will for each individual, but he had never truly understood what it meant to discern that will. As the old man walked away, leaving only a faint scent of rosemary behind, Jonathan was left with a feeling of both confusion and hope. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. In a small town nestled between green hills and calm rivers, lived a young man named Jonathan. He was raised in a modest household, with a loving mother and a father who was a fisherman. From an early age, Jonathan was taught the importance of hard work, humility, and the idea that life wasn't just about what you had, but who you were. His parents often shared stories of how they had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, teaching Jonathan the value of resilience and the strength of belief. Jonathan, however, found himself struggling with the traditional path laid out before him. The town he lived in had a rhythm, one that revolved around the steady routine of farming, fishing, and community gatherings. But Jonathan, ever curious, felt that there was something more he was meant to do with his life. He often found himself staring at the horizon, wondering about the world beyond his small town. One evening, as he was walking by the river, deep in thought about his future, he met an old man who had appeared out of nowhere. The man, with a long white beard and wise, tired eyes, seemed like he had been waiting for Jonathan. He approached him with a gentle smile, as though he knew exactly what the young man was going through. "Young man," the old man said softly, "I can see the questions in your heart. You are searching for something, aren't you?" Jonathan, startled by the old man's insight, nodded. "I feel as though I'm meant for more than this, but I don't know where to start or how to find what I'm looking for." The old man chuckled. "The answers you seek are not always easy to find, but they are always within you. You must learn to discern them, to listen to the whispers of your heart, and to trust the guidance that comes from a source far beyond yourself." At that moment, Jonathan felt a spark of curiosity ignite within him. He had always heard stories about divine guidance, about God's will for each individual, but he had never truly understood what it meant to discern that will. As the old man walked away, leaving only a faint scent of rosemary behind, Jonathan was left with a feeling of both confusion and hope. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Jonathan's life began to take a different course after that evening by the river. The encounter with the old man stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't fully articulate. but he knew that his life was about to be changed forever. He spent the next few days walking the familiar paths of his village. Yet everything seemed different now. The sky appeared more vibrant, the sounds of the river more profound, and even the rustling of leaves in the trees seemed to carry a deeper meaning. It was as though the universe had shifted, and Jonathan's awareness had been awakened. He could no longer ignore the questions that had been buried in the depths of his heart. The mundane routine of fishing, helping his father in the fields, and attending community events no longer satisfied him. He felt the weight of his unfulfilled purpose pressing down on him. What was he meant to do with his life? Was he destined to live a life like his father's, content but bound by routine? Or was there something greater waiting for him? Something that would bring him closer to the divine plan for his life? One afternoon, unable to shake the feeling that he needed to seek out answers, Jonathan decided to leave his small village behind. He packed only the essentials, a small bag with clothes, a few coins, and a worn map his father had given him years ago, and set off on foot. The old man's words echoed in his mind. You must learn to discern them, to listen to the whispers of your heart. It was unclear to Jonathan what exactly that meant, but he knew he had to try. As he ventured farther from his home, Jonathan entered a dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever. The trees were ancient, towering above him with their thick trunks and leaves that whispered secrets in the wind. He could feel the presence of something greater around him, a sense that he was no longer just a man walking through the woods but a part of something much larger. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the quiet stillness of the forest seemed to press down on him. For days, Jonathan wandered without a clear direction, guided only by the faint compass of his heart. Each step felt like an answer in itself, as though he was meant to be exactly where he was at that moment. He slept under the stars, ate simple meals from the land, and reflected on the nature of his journey. What was he seeking, and how could he possibly discern the will of God if he didn't even understand what it meant to listen to his own heart? One night, as he sat by a crackling fire, Jonathan heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. At first, he thought it might be a wild animal or another traveler. But as the figure drew closer, he realized it was the old man once again. The figure emerged from the shadows, his long white beard catching the firelight, and his wise eyes twinkled with a knowing smile. You've come a long way, Jonathan, the old man said, his voice like the wind itself, gentle but firm. Jonathan stood up in surprise, feeling both comforted and bewildered by the old man's sudden reappearance. How did you find me? The old man laughed softly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You've been seeking answers in the right place. But the journey you are on is not about finding a destination, but about understanding the path you walk and the decisions you make along the way. The will of God is not always a grand revelation. Sometimes it comes in the smallest of moments. Jonathan sat back down, feeling both humbled and intrigued by the old man's words. But how do I know if I'm on the right path? How do I discern what God wants from me? The old man's eyes glinted with something that was both sorrowful and wise. The answers come when you stop looking for them in the obvious places and begin listening to your soul. Discerning God's will isn't about receiving a clear, unmistakable sign. It's about understanding your heart and aligning your will with His. The journey, my young friend, is the process of transformation. Jonathan sat in silence, contemplating the old man's words. He had expected some kind of divine revelation or sign. But what the old man was saying was different. It was not about receiving an answer. It was about becoming something more, something aligned with a higher purpose. Over the next several days, Jonathan spent more time in solitude, meditating on the old man's words. He sat by the river, listened to the wind through the trees, and tried to quiet his mind. The forest became his sanctuary, a place where he could listen, not only to the world around him but to the stillness within. Slowly, he began to notice things he hadn't before, the way the light filtered through the trees, the way the river moved with purpose, The way his own breath matched the rhythm of the earth. He began to understand, at least in part, that to discern God's will was not about asking for a specific direction, but about finding harmony with the world around him. It was then that Jonathan had an epiphany. As he sat near a quiet stream, he realized that the search for God's will was not a singular event. It was a process, one that required patience, faith, and a willingness to surrender control. For the first time, he understood that the journey itself, his experiences, his doubts, his moments of clarity and confusion, was all part of the divine plan. He didn't need to have all the answers, he needed only to keep walking. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Jonathan came across a small village. The people there were humble farmers, living simple, peaceful lives. At first, Jonathan hesitated. Should he stay, or should he continue his search? But something within him urged him to stay a while, to listen to the stories of the villagers, to understand their lives and their faith. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan lived among the villagers, helping them with their daily tasks and learning from their wisdom. Each day, he discovered more about what it meant to live in alignment with a higher purpose. The villagers spoke of their faith with quiet conviction, not in grand gestures or proclamations, but in the way they treated each other, the way they worked, and the way they trusted in God's plan. It was here, in this humble village, that Jonathan began to understand the true meaning of discerning God's will. It wasn't about grand adventures or dramatic moments, it was about the small choices, the everyday decisions that reflected one's heart and values. The villagers' faith was not about waiting for a dramatic sign from God. It was about living each day with intention, knowing that God's will was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Jonathan's time in the small village was a period of growth and quiet reflection. The villagers, though simple in their ways, carried an unspoken wisdom that Jonathan found both grounding and inspiring. His initial days were spent learning their ways, helping in the fields, tending to animals, and assisting in the small chores that filled their days. But it was not the physical labor that Jonathan found most enlightening. It was the conversations he had with the villagers during their shared meals, the stories they told, and the subtle expressions of faith that filled their daily lives. One afternoon, as Jonathan sat with an older woman named Anna by the fire, he asked her about her life. She was a widow who had lived in the village for most of her life. Her face was weathered, her hands calloused, but her eyes held a gentleness that seemed to hold a lifetime of wisdom. "Anna, how do you know what God wants from you?" Jonathan asked, a question that had been gnawing at his heart for weeks. "How do you know what path you should take in life?" Anna smiled softly, stirring the pot of stew in front of her. "My dear, it's not always about knowing exactly what path you're on," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It's about doing what's right in front of you. You don't always need a sign to tell you what to do. Sometimes, it's simply about being faithful in the small things." Jonathan sat back, contemplating her words. It was so simple, yet profound. He had been searching for something big, something grand, but perhaps the key to discerning God's will was not found in a single moment of clarity, but in the small, everyday choices that shaped the course of his life. As the days passed, Jonathan began to observe the villagers with a new perspective. He saw how they worked tirelessly, not for recognition or reward, but because it was simply what needed to be done. They planted crops, tended to livestock, and cared for one another with a quiet sense of duty. There were no fanfares, no accolades, just a deep, unshakable faith that guided their every action. One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, Jonathan found himself alone at the edge of the village, staring out at the rolling hills. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the landscape. It was in this peaceful moment that he had an epiphany. He was learning to discern God's will not by seeking grand gestures or dramatic signs, but by learning to serve others and be present in the moments that made up his days. The villagers didn't wait for a calling to serve, they simply did what was needed. They didn't ask, "What is God's will for me?" They asked, "How can I be faithful in this moment?" In that moment, Jonathan realized that his journey was less about finding an external sign of what God wanted him to do, and more about becoming the kind of person who was ready to respond to the needs of the world around him. It was not about having everything figured out, but about trusting that each step, no matter how small, was part of the larger plan. The next morning, Jonathan took his first step in applying this new understanding. He spent the day helping the villagers with their harvest, working alongside them not for the sake of recognition, but simply to help. As they worked, they talked about their lives, their faith, and their hopes for the future. Jonathan was amazed at the quiet strength these people possessed. They didn't talk much about their faith in grand terms. Instead, they showed it in their actions. They didn't need to be told to love one another, to serve one another, or to live with purpose. It was simply who they were. One evening, after a long day of work, Jonathan sat with Anna again, reflecting on his time in the village. "Anna," he said, "I think I'm starting to understand. It's not about searching for a big moment, but about being faithful in the small things. I've been waiting for some grand revelation, but maybe it's the everyday actions, the quiet moments, that truly matter." Anna nodded, her smile warm. "You're beginning to see, Jonathan. God's will isn't always something you find, it's something you live. The more you live with faith, the more you align yourself with His purpose, and that purpose will unfold in the little things, one step at a time." Jonathan sat in silence, feeling the weight of her words settle into his heart. The sense of peace that had eluded him for so long was beginning to take root. He had been so focused on the destination, the grand, shining moment of clarity, that he had overlooked the quiet, steady path that lay before him. But now, he realized, the journey was not about finding a single, definitive answer. It was about embracing each moment with purpose and faith. As the weeks passed, Jonathan's understanding of God's will continued to deepen. The village had become a place of learning for him, not only in the physical tasks he performed, but in the spiritual lessons he gleaned from the villagers. He learned to appreciate the beauty of simplicity and the power of small, everyday choices. The more he helped, the more he listened, and the more he lived in the present, the clearer his purpose became. One day, while working in the fields, Jonathan was approached by a young man named Tomas. Tomas was a few years younger than Jonathan, and like him, he had always felt a sense of longing for something more. The two had struck up a friendship over the past few weeks, and Tomas had been eager to hear about Jonathan's journey. "Jonathan," Tomas said, his voice filled with curiosity, "do you ever feel like you're meant for something more than this?" "I know I do. I feel like there's something out there, something greater than what we have here." Jonathan looked at Tomas, feeling a sense of understanding. He had felt the same way once, like there was something more waiting for him, something he needed to find. But now, he realized that the answer was not in searching for something external, but in discovering the purpose in the present. "I did once," Jonathan said, his voice thoughtful, "but now I see that purpose isn't about finding something grand or far away. It's about doing the right thing right here, right now. It's about being faithful in the small things, and letting those things add up. Maybe that's the greater purpose." Tomas looked at him, a mixture of confusion and realization crossing his face. "You mean, we don't have to go searching for something? We just need to do what's in front of us?" Jonathan nodded. "Exactly. Sometimes, we make it more complicated than it needs to be. God's will isn't a single, distant thing, it's a series of small, daily decisions. It's in how we treat others, how we live with purpose, and how we serve. It's all part of His plan." Tomas seemed to digest Jonathan's words carefully, then nodded slowly. "I think I understand. Maybe it's not about going somewhere, but about becoming something. Thank you, Jonathan." Jonathan smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. In that moment, he realized that his journey had come full circle. He had begun his quest for purpose with the belief that he needed to find something external, something grand, but now, he knew the truth. The path he sought had always been right in front of him. In the everyday moments of service, love, and faith, as Jonathan continued his time in the village, his understanding of God's will deepened, becoming more and more clear with each passing day. He found himself at peace with the idea that he didn't need to chase after something grand or distant. He was coming to understand that the divine was not something to be found at the end of a long and winding journey, rather, it was embedded in the choices he made, the ways in which he interacted with the people around him, and the purpose he brought into his daily work. One morning, Jonathan awoke to a heavy fog that had settled over the village. The landscape was shrouded in a soft, ethereal mist that blurred the edges of the world. He sat by the window of the small cottage he had been staying in, watching as the villagers began their daily routines in the soft light. There was a stillness in the air, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jonathan felt the need to go outside, to experience the peace that the fog seemed to promise. As he walked toward the village center, he noticed Anna sitting on a bench by the side of the road. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed in quiet prayer. There was something in her presence that radiated calm, an aura of peace that seemed to transcend the ordinary. Jonathan sat beside her, not speaking at first, but simply absorbing the serenity that surrounded them both. After a few moments of silence, Anna opened her eyes and smiled at him. "Jonathan," she said softly, "do you know what it means to walk in faith?" Jonathan looked at her, unsure of what she meant. "I think I understand faith. But, walking in it? How is that different?" Anna chuckled gently, her voice warm. "Faith is not just something you believe. It's something you live. To walk in faith means to make choices, to take steps, even when you don't know what lies ahead. It means trusting that each step, no matter how small, is leading you where you are meant to go." Jonathan thought about her words for a moment. "But how do you know you're making the right choices? How do you trust that your steps are the ones you're supposed to take?" Anna paused for a moment, her gaze turning toward the fog that still lingered over the village. "You don't always know. That's where faith comes in. It's not about certainty, but about trust. The more you walk in faith, the more you begin to understand the rhythm of the world, the flow of God's will in your life." Jonathan nodded slowly. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and he saw everything more clearly. The truth was that walking in faith didn't mean having all the answers. It meant trusting that the steps he took, no matter how uncertain or unclear, were part of a bigger plan. A divine rhythm that he was learning to tune into. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan continued to work alongside the villagers, helping them with their daily tasks. He no longer saw these tasks as mere chores, but as opportunities to live out the lessons he had been learning. Whether it was mending a fence, carrying water from the well, or helping with the harvest, he began to feel a sense of purpose in each moment. He no longer asked, "What am I supposed to do with my life?" Instead, he asked, "How can I serve in this moment?" One afternoon, as Jonathan worked in the fields, he felt a sudden sense of longing for something more. For the first time in weeks, he found himself thinking about his family back in the village where he had grown up. He missed them, the familiar sounds of his father's boat returning to the dock, the laughter of his mother as she prepared meals, the simple comfort of home. But at the same time, he knew that he could never go back to the way things were. He had changed. His journey had altered the way he saw the world, and he knew that his path lay elsewhere, not in returning to the familiar, but in continuing forward. That evening, after supper, Jonathan sat by the fire with Anna. She could see the look of contemplation in his eyes. "You're thinking of going, aren't you?" she asked gently. Jonathan nodded. "I think it's time for me to move on. I've learned so much here, but I feel that my journey is calling me elsewhere." Anna smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "The journey doesn't end, Jonathan. It's just a new beginning. You're not meant to stay in one place forever. The lessons you've learned here are with you now. They'll guide you wherever you go." Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was true. His journey was not about staying in one place or finding the perfect moment of clarity. It was about living out God's will in each and every step he took. Wherever that path led him. The next morning, as he prepared to leave the village, the fog had lifted, revealing a bright, clear sky. The village seemed to sparkle in the early light, as if it were blessing him on his journey. Anna stood by the gate, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes filled with a quiet confidence. "Remember, Jonathan," she said, "it's not about the destination. It's about the journey. Walk in faith, and trust that the path will unfold as you go." Jonathan nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. He was no longer the same young man who had arrived in the village. Unsure of his purpose, he had learned to listen, to serve, and to trust the small, quiet moments of his life. He was ready to move forward, knowing that God's will wasn't something he had to chase, it was something he had to live. As Jonathan walked away from the village, he felt a deep sense of peace. He didn't know where the road would take him next, but he no longer feared the uncertainty. The path ahead was unknown, but he had learned to walk in faith, trusting that every step was part of a greater plan. With each step he took, Jonathan knew that he was not alone. God's presence was with him, guiding him, teaching him, and leading him forward. As Jonathan continued his journey, he found that each step was no longer weighed down by the uncertainty that had once troubled him. The road ahead was still unknown, but the lessons he had learned in the village, the wisdom of Anna, the faith of the villagers, and the quiet strength that came from living out God's will in the present moment, had transformed him. He had learned to walk in faith, not with a map or a grand plan, but with a deep trust that each step he took was part of something larger, something beautiful, and something divinely orchestrated. Days turned into weeks, and Jonathan traveled from village to village, helping where he could, listening to the stories of others, and offering a hand to those in need. Each place he visited brought new insights, new challenges, and new opportunities to serve. And in every interaction, whether with a farmer struggling to feed his family, a widow mourning her loss, or a young child longing for guidance, Jonathan felt the presence of God in the simplest of moments. He realized that his journey was not just about finding a place to call home or discovering a grand purpose for his life. It was about becoming the person he was meant to be, someone who could bring light into the darkness, who could offer comfort in times of sorrow, and who could help others see the beauty of faith in the mundane, everyday moments of life. One day, as he sat by a campfire under a sky full of stars, Jonathan reflected on how far he had come. The man he had been when he first left his home, full of doubt and searching for meaning, was no longer the man he had become. He no longer saw life as a puzzle to be solved, but as a journey to be lived. And in that living, he was discovering his purpose, not through searching for it, but through living faithfully in every small action. It was in this moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, that Jonathan finally understood the deeper truth he had been seeking all along. The will of God was not something to be discerned with grand gestures or moments of clarity. It was something to be lived. It was found in the choices we made, in how we loved and served, in the small acts of kindness and generosity that, over time, formed a life of meaning and purpose. He remembered the words Anna had shared with him in the village. It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. He had spent so much time looking for a destination, for a clear and unmistakable sign that would tell him exactly what to do with his life. But the truth, as he now saw it, was that the destination was never the point. The journey itself, the way we walk it, the people we meet along the way, and the way we live out our faith in every moment, is the point. Jonathan knew now that his journey wasn't over. It wasn't meant to have a neat and tidy conclusion. Life was not about arriving at some grand conclusion, but about continuing forward, trusting that each step, no matter how uncertain, was leading him toward his purpose. His purpose was to love, to serve, and to live faithfully in the moments that made up his life. As the fire crackled before him, Jonathan smiled to himself. He had found peace. not in knowing every detail of his future, but in knowing that he was walking the path he was meant to walk. With each new day, he would continue to live in faith, embracing whatever came his way with the confidence that God was with him, guiding him, and loving him every step of the way. And so, with a heart full of hope and a spirit ready to serve, Jonathan continued on his journey, no longer searching for answers, but living the answers that had already been given to him. He understood now that the will of God was not a distant destination to be reached, but a path to be walked with faith, love, and trust. His story was still unfolding, and he knew that the next chapter would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities for growth, but with the lessons of the village in his heart and the love of God in his soul. Jonathan was ready for whatever came next. He was no longer seeking a grand revelation, for he had come to realize that the greatest revelation of all was found in the simple, everyday acts of living with purpose. In the end, Jonathan had learned the most important lesson of all, that God's will for his life was not a destination to be discovered, but a journey to be lived with faith, hope, and love. And with that, he stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that each step was part of a greater, divine story, a story that was still being written.